The gang ruled through fear, bleeding the desperate dry, forcing sick patients to pay for protection they'd never get. When they turned to a small clinic, they saw nothing but easy money and a black nurse too afraid to resist. But they had chosen the wrong person. What they didn't know was that she had been forged in war, a combat nurse who had seen more violence than they could ever inflict, someone who knew how to fight and, more importantly, how to win. They mistook kindness for weakness, never realizing they had just started a fight they couldn't survive. By the time they saw their mistake, their empire would be in ruins, and fear would no longer be theirs to control. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The air in Ironwood always smelled of something burned, like the city itself had long been scorched and never quite recovered. The scent of charred metal, distant gasoline, and something chemical that seeped into the skin like a warning. The people had learned to live with it, just like they learned to live with the decay, the crime, the inevitable tightening of an invisible noose around their throats. Inside Solace Clinic, the smell was different. Antiseptic and old wood, the sharp sting of alcohol wipes clashing against the coppery scent of blood. Celine Dorn moved between the beds like a soldier in a war zone, quick but steady, her dark skin gleaming under the fluorescent lights as she worked. She stood out in Ironwood, not just because she was a nurse, and not just because she was new to some of the older patients who still whispered about how the clinic used to be run by their kind, meaning white hands, pale faces, people they trusted by default. No, Celine stood out because she was a black woman, in a place that didn't expect black women to be the ones in charge. In Ironwood, black folks were either struggling or surviving, but never the ones pulling others out of the gutter. A nurse like Celine? That was new, and not everyone liked new. She had learned to ignore it. The stares, the skepticism, the patients who second-guessed her advice until Dr. Henshaw repeated it word for word. Those things didn't matter. What mattered was the blood under her gloves, the thread in her needle, the heartbeat she could keep going a little longer. Celine wasn't here to be liked. She was here to keep people alive. "Mrs. Holloway, I told you to be careful." Her voice was smooth, but the sharp edge of worry cut through it. The elderly woman before her sat stiffly on the exam table, her thin frame wrapped in a housecoat that had seen better days. Her face was swollen, bruises blooming along her jaw like an artist's careless brushstroke. Blood still crusted along her temple where the skin had split. Mrs. Agnes Holloway, 83 years old and stubborn as rust, gave Celine a wry, gap-toothed smile. "I was careful," Celine exhaled sharply. "Lying to your nurse? That's a sin, you know. So is putting too much faith in certain people." Celine's fingers hesitated just for a fraction of a second, then resumed cleaning the wound. She had heard that tone before. Mrs. Holloway wasn't outright nasty. She wasn't the type to spit slurs, wasn't the type to yell about people like you. She was the type to say things with a polite kind of venom, the kind that settled just beneath the skin, waiting to sting later. The type to glance at Celine's hands and then double-check that the stitches were even, as if darker skin meant unsteady fingers. Celine had dealt with worse, much worse. She dabbed an alcohol-soaked cloth along the wound and felt the way Mrs. Holloway winced but refused to make a sound. This wasn't the first time the old woman had come in like this. "I fell," Mrs. Holloway muttered. Celine gave her a long, unimpressed look. "Fell into something hard, huh?" "Slipped." Celine traced the bruising along the older woman's wrist. Circular, precise. A grip mark, not a fall. She pressed her thumb against the discoloration just slightly, feeling the way Mrs. Holloway's muscles tensed. A careful injury, not a careless one. Celine didn't press, not yet. Instead, she let the silence stretch before she spoke again, her voice even. "Where?" A pause. "Too long. The steps." "Mrs. Holloway said finally." Celine nodded slowly, but something sat heavy in her stomach. There was no hesitation in truth, only in lies. Mrs. Holloway must have noticed the way Celine's lips pressed into a thin line because she sniffed and shook her head. "Oh, don't go making that face, girl. Some things just happen. Some of us just ain't lucky." Celine rolled the gauze a little tighter around her arm than necessary, making the old woman suck in a sharp breath. "You're not unlucky, Mrs. Holloway," she murmured. "Somebody put their hands on you." The room went still. A beat. And then Mrs. Holloway made a sound in her throat. Not a laugh, not agreement, just something close to inevitability. "You try to take care of people, Celine, but you can't save everyone." Celine studied her for a long moment, that unease curling deeper in her ribs. "I know," she said. She just wasn't sure who needed saving yet. The bruise on Mrs. Holloway's jaw sat heavy in Celine's mind, lingering even as she tried to push it aside, convincing herself that not every injury carried a hidden story. The clinic was moving at its usual pace. Too fast, never enough hands, always someone needing more help than they were going to get. The waiting room had been overflowing since morning, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic, and the kind of exhaustion that came from people who had learned long ago that suffering was just another part of their lives. Still, between the pulse readings, the whispered reassurances, the sutures, and the medications, Celine started noticing things she couldn't ignore. A man who cradled his ribs a little too carefully, his fingers pressing against his side as if he feared something inside him had already cracked. A woman who winced at the touch of a blood pressure cuff, her forearm already mottled with bruises beneath the sleeves of her sweater. A teenage boy who sat stiffly in his chair, his right eye swelling shut, his gaze cast downward, as if looking at anyone too long might invite something worse. It wasn't unusual for patients to come in with injuries, not in a place like Ironwood, where life itself could be just as damaging as disease. But today, there were too many bruises, too many injuries that looked too deliberate, too many nervous glances between patients who refused to make eye contact with her, with the staff, with anyone who might ask questions. She watched them carefully, listening as they all gave the same quiet, dismissive explanations. "I slipped on the stairs. I wasn't paying attention. I walked into something. It's nothing, really. No, I don't need a report filed. No, I don't need help. No, no, no." And it wasn't just the words. It was the way they said them, the way their hands tightened in their laps, the way their voices softened when they should have been louder, the way they looked at her like she was someone who might help if only help was an option. By the time the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement outside, Celine had seen enough. The last few patients had cleared out, the clinic falling into the kind of stillness that only came after a long day. And yet, the tension beneath her ribs had only grown heavier. She was locking up when she noticed the last patient lingering by the door, an older man with a slight tremor in his hands, his expression tight in that way that came from someone weighing whether or not to ask for something they weren't sure they could have. Celine studied him for a moment before she spoke, her voice steady, the way it always was when she sensed someone needed reassurance more than a diagnosis. "You need anything else, Mr. Kessler?" The man hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, as if debating whether to speak. Finally, after a pause that stretched just a second too long, he cleared his throat. "Just heading home," he murmured, voice rough, a forced casualness behind it that didn't quite land. "Figured I'd wait until the streets got a little quieter." Celine didn't move right away, watching the way his fingers twitched slightly at his side, the way he looked past her instead of at her. "Which way you headed?" "Couple blocks south," he answered. "Not far." Ironwood wasn't the kind of place where people admitted they were afraid, not openly, not in ways that could be used against them later. But this was the closest thing to a request for help as she was going to get. Celine nodded once, stepping away from the clinic doors, the key still in her hand. "Come on, I'll walk with you." The relief in Mr. Kessler's expression was brief, but it was there. He didn't thank her, didn't say much of anything as they started down the street, but he didn't have to. The city was different at night, the cracks in its foundation more pronounced, the darkness pressing into the spaces between streetlights, stretching into alleyways where figures shifted just out of view. The sound of a bottle breaking somewhere in the distance, the dull thump of music pulsing from a car idling at a corner, the occasional burst of laughter sharp enough to cut through the air. They walked in silence, moving past the liquor store with its neon open sign buzzing weakly in the window, past the alley where cigarette embers flared and faded in the hands of men who never seemed to go home, past the laundromat where a woman sat behind the counter, staring blankly at a television playing something no one was really watching. And then, as they neared the next block, Celine saw them. The thorn serpents weren't hard to spot. There were 3 of them, standing just off the curb where the glow of a street lamp barely reached. One leaned lazily against a metal railing, cigarette dangling between his fingers, his attention flickering between the people passing by and whatever conversation was happening in front of him. Another was speaking to a man who stood rigid, hands clutched tightly around the handles of his wheelchair, his expression tight, unreadable. The third had his back to Celine, but she could see the tension in the way he stood, the way his body language screamed control. Mr. Kessler stiffened beside her, his steps faltering, his breath catching just slightly before he forced himself to keep walking. Celine recognized the man in the wheelchair immediately. Henry Vargas had been coming to the clinic for months now, an ex-con who had lost the use of his legs in an accident long after he'd done his time. A man who tried to keep his head down, who never asked for anything he hadn't earned, who always paid his bills in cash and never took favors. And right now, he was being shaken down. Celine didn't stop walking, but her pace slowed, her gaze flickering over the scene as she took in the details. The subtle shift of the man closest to Henry, the way his hand dipped toward his pocket, the way Henry's jaw locked like he was forcing himself not to react. There was no shouting, no obvious aggression, nothing loud or messy, just quiet, calculated pressure, the kind that let people know what was expected of them without needing to spell it out. Celine inhaled deeply through her nose, keeping her expression neutral, her posture loose, even as every muscle in her body tensed. She wasn't reckless, wasn't the kind of person who went looking for a fight without knowing exactly how it was going to end. But this was different. She might not have known exactly what had been happening to her patients, but now, watching the way Henry sat stone still in his chair, watching the way Mr. Kessler averted his gaze as they walked past, she knew enough. Knew that whatever was happening had already dug itself deep into ironwood, had already started bleeding through the cracks, had already taken hold of the people who could least afford to fight back. She could keep walking. She could keep pretending she hadn't seen anything. Or, Celine exhaled slowly, her fingers flexing once at her sides before curling into her palms. She didn't need to finish the thought. She already knew what she was going to do. The streetlights in Ironwood flickered inconsistently, casting long, wavering shadows across the cracked pavement. But the 3 men standing near the curb didn't need the light to see who was passing. They had already clocked Celine the moment she turned the corner with Kessler at her side, their eyes flicking toward her with the casual awareness of men who were used to knowing everything happening on their turf. The one standing closest to Henry Vargas smirked at something his friend said, shaking his head before rolling his shoulders, the movement slow and deliberate, as if stretching before a fight that had already been decided. The arrogance was easy to see, thick in the way they stood, in the way they barely acknowledged the older man in the wheelchair, treating him like an inconvenience rather than a person. Celine had been around men like them before. She knew exactly how they thought. They wouldn't look at her as a threat. Not now, not yet. Not a black woman in scrubs, not someone they saw as nothing more than another tired nurse getting off a shift. And that was exactly why they weren't ready for what was coming. Celine adjusted the strap of her bag as she slowed her steps, her gaze scanning the street, her posture loose but deliberate, giving no indication of tension. Kessler kept walking a few paces ahead, his body tight, his breathing shallow, but she could see the way his shoulders shifted slightly. An unspoken question. She didn't answer, not with words. Instead, she veered just slightly, cutting across the sidewalk, her movements smooth, unhurried, as if she were just another passerby taking the long way home. But instead of crossing the street, instead of walking past the scene like she hadn't noticed, she stopped just before the curb, her gaze settling on Henry Vargas. She had treated Henry before. She had seen what pride looked like when it was held together with barely stitched resolve, and right now he was cracking at the seams. "You good, Henry?" Her voice was calm, level, just another quiet conversation on the street. The man closest to Henry turned slightly, his stance adjusting just enough to acknowledge her, though there was nothing in his body language that suggested he was concerned by her presence. He was younger than she expected up close, barely in his 20s, his face smooth, but his eyes sharp in a way that said he had learned quickly what it took to survive in Ironwood. "Didn't realize we had a neighborhood watch now," he murmured, the smirk never leaving his face as he took a lazy step forward, his gaze raking over her scrubs before settling on her face. "Or is this just charity work?" Selene ignored him, keeping her eyes on Henry, waiting for the older man to answer, to say anything at all. But he didn't. He just kept staring straight ahead, his jaw locked tight, his knuckles bone white against the arms of his chair. One of the other men, the one leaning against the railing with the cigarette still dangling from his fingers, exhaled sharply before shaking his head, his laugh low and full of something ugly. "Man, come on. You really trying to be a hero right now?" Selene tilted her head slightly, finally shifting her gaze to them. "I'm just checking on my patient," she said simply, her voice calm but firm. The first guy grinned, his teeth flashing against the dim light. "Patient? Damn, you work overtime or something? Maybe you should be minding your own business instead of sticking your nose in places it don't belong." Selene let out a slow breath, her weight shifting slightly, barely enough to be noticeable. "Maybe you should let him go," she said evenly. For a moment, the three men were quiet. And then the one in front of her shook his head, the grin widening, his body language loose, casual, like a predator playing with its food. "Man, listen to this. She really thinks she's got a say in this." He turned slightly toward the others, his voice exaggerated. "You hear that? This nurse?" He dragged the word out like an insult, letting it settle between them. "She thinks she can tell us what to do." The cigarette smoker exhaled, his amusement apparent. "Ain't that something? What you gonna do, sweetheart? Give us a checkup? You got a stethoscope in that bag?" Selene could feel the tension growing, but she didn't move, didn't react to the bait, because she knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't worried, not even a little. They thought they had already won. The first man, the leader, or at least the one most eager to play the role, stepped closer, his height forcing her to look up slightly, though her posture never shifted. "Maybe you should get out of here before someone gets hurt," he murmured, the false sympathy in his voice barely masking the threat beneath. "I get it. You want to help people, right? That's real sweet, real noble. But this," he gestured vaguely toward Henry, still seated, still silent, "ain't got nothing to do with you. So how about you walk away, huh? Maybe we forget this ever happened." Selene inhaled slowly, her fingers flexing just once against the strap of her bag, before she exhaled again, controlled, measured. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The leader sighed, shaking his head like she was disappointing him, like this was just another hassle in his night that needed to be handled. "All right then," he muttered, rolling his shoulders before taking another step forward, closing the distance between them. "I tried." The movement was fast, faster than most people would have expected from someone his size. But Selene wasn't most people. She saw the shift in his weight before his arm even moved, caught the subtle twitch in his shoulder just before he reached out, his fingers aiming for her collar, for her throat, for anything he could grab. But he never made contact. Selene moved first. She caught his wrist before it could close around her shirt, twisting it sharply to the side, forcing his arm into an unnatural angle, her grip tightening with surgical precision. Before he could even process the pain, she shifted her weight and drove her elbow into the center of his chest, her strike landing with enough force to send him stumbling back a step. The cigarette smoker barely had time to react before Selene pivoted, her next strike already in motion. She moved like a professional, efficient, ruthless, unhesitating. A sharp jab to the ribs, a hook to the jaw, the kind of hits designed to disable, not just hurt. The leader barely managed to recover before lunging forward again, his face twisted with something between rage and disbelief. But Selene was already anticipating the movement, already adjusting her stance to meet him. She had spent years learning how to fight in conditions far worse than this, had trained for scenarios where hesitation meant death, where survival depended on knowing how to dismantle an opponent before they had the chance to do the same to you. And right now, these men, they had no idea who they had just picked a fight with. The first man hit the ground hard, his balance thrown by a perfectly executed takedown. But before she could shift her attention to the others, she felt movement at her back. The cigarette smoker was coming for her. The moment Selene twisted the leader's wrist and sent him sprawling onto the pavement, the air shifted, the easy arrogance that had been so thick in the air shattering in an instant. The other two weren't laughing anymore, their smug expressions melting into something sharper, something meaner, something that said they had just realized their mistake. But realization wasn't hesitation. The cigarette smoker moved first. He came at her fast, lunging with an open hand, trying to grab her, trying to overwhelm her with size and weight, maybe hoping that if he got his hands on her, he could throw her down, end this before it really started. But Selene didn't let people get their hands on her. She sidestepped just as his fingers grazed the fabric of her scrubs, pivoting sharply before slamming the heel of her palm into the side of his head. He stumbled, his balance thrown off for just a second. But she didn't give him a chance to recover. She pressed forward, hooking her foot behind his knee and sweeping his legs out from under him in a single, fluid motion. He hit the ground hard, his breath rushing out in a sharp grunt. But before she could follow up, before she could make sure he stayed down, pain exploded against her ribs. Selene barely had time to react before she felt the second hit. A sharp, brutal kick slamming into her stomach, sending her stumbling back a step, air torn from her lungs. The third man, the quiet one, the one who had been watching, waiting, had finally decided to move. And he was fast. Before she could fully recover, he closed the distance between them, his fists already swinging. Selene barely managed to raise her arms in time to absorb the impact, feeling the shock of it vibrate through her bones as his knuckles slammed into her forearms. This one knew how to fight. He wasn't just throwing wild punches, wasn't flailing like someone who relied on brute strength alone. His hits were controlled, strategic, his stance solid, the kind of fighter who had been in enough brawls to know how to break someone down piece by piece. Selene adjusted quickly, her body moving on instinct, blocking, stepping back, repositioning, trying to regain control. But then the leader was back on his feet, and now it was 3 against 1. The leader, his face twisted in fury, lunged forward again, swinging wild, uncoordinated but furious, trying to make her pay for knocking him down in front of his men. Selene ducked just in time to avoid the blow, but before she could counter, a second set of hands grabbed at her from behind. The cigarette smoker, already recovered, already trying to wrap his arms around her, pin her down. Selene reacted instantly. She slammed her heel down on his foot, hard enough to hear the sharp grunt of pain that followed, then threw her head back, cracking the back of her skull against his nose. His grip loosened just enough, just for a second, and that was all she needed. She twisted free, turning just as he staggered, blood dripping from his nose, his expression shifting from shock to rage. "You!" His voice was raw with fury, his lip curled, his hands already curling into fists. But Selene didn't give him the chance to finish. She drove her knee up into his stomach, knocking the wind out of him, before snapping her elbow across his temple. His body crumpled, knees buckling as he dropped onto the pavement, barely conscious before he hit the ground. One down, but there was no time to celebrate. The quiet one was already moving, already capitalizing on her split-second distraction. His fist drove forward, aiming for her ribs again, and this time he landed the hit. Pain flared sharp and immediate, radiating outward. But Celine gritted her teeth and absorbed the blow, twisting with it instead of against it, using the momentum to turn and drive her elbow into his jaw. His head snapped to the side, but he barely stumbled, shaking it off too quickly. This one was tough. She could feel it, the difference in the way he took the hit, the way his feet stayed planted, the way his eyes stayed locked on hers, calculating, measuring, already adjusting. Celine barely had time to shift back into her stance before she felt something grab at her leg. The leader, back again, snarling as he yanked at her ankle, trying to take her down. She stumbled, but she didn't fall. Instead, she let him pull just enough to give him the illusion of control, just enough to trick him into thinking he had the upper hand. And then she drove the sharp edge of her foot into his chest, kicking him so hard he hit the pavement with a breathless, choking sound. The quiet one was already stepping forward, his arms raised, his weight shifting, going for the kill. Celine took a slow breath, her body coiled, ready. The leader struggled to catch his breath, his chest heaving as he pressed a hand against the pavement, trying to steady himself. The sharp edge of disbelief flickered across his face, his mind working to process how he had lost control so completely. His fingers curled weakly, his entire body tensed as if bracing for another attack. But Celine wasn't moving. Not yet. A few feet away, the cigarette smoker groaned, blood still dripping from his nose, his hand shaking as he wiped it against his sleeve. He shifted, struggling to sit up, his movements slow and uneven, the pain making it clear that whatever had happened to him wasn't something he would be shaking off anytime soon. His dazed expression carried something heavier than just physical hurt. Humiliation. The quiet one, the fighter, was still watching her. He hadn't tried to get up, hadn't said a word, but there was something calculating in his stare, something cold and steady that told her he had already decided this wasn't over. He wasn't like the others. His pride wasn't loud, wasn't fragile, wasn't something that shattered the moment he hit the pavement. He was the kind of man who would sit with this, let it simmer, let it turn into something else. Celine remained still, her breath controlled, the ache in her ribs a dull but constant reminder that she hadn't walked away untouched. The silence between them stretched, heavy, and weighted, pressing down on the three men like a lesson they hadn't expected to be taught. They had made a mistake. They had underestimated her. And now, they knew it. The leader, still gasping slightly, finally found his voice, though it came out rough, strained, almost unsure. "Who the hell are you?" The words weren't defiant, weren't an attempt to reclaim what had already been lost. It was a question asked by a man who had just had his world realigned, who had stepped into something certain of his power, and had been forced to realize, too late, that power wasn't something given, it was something earned. Celine exhaled, rolling out her shoulders, shaking the last bit of tension from her muscles as she took a slow step forward, watching as the leader flinched just slightly, his body betraying him. She could feel the others watching her, waiting for what came next, waiting for the moment she would drive the final nail into the coffin of their confidence. "Just a nurse," she said, her voice calm, measured, letting the words sink in, letting them understand what that meant, letting them sit with the knowledge that they had just been beaten by someone they never even considered a threat. The leader didn't say anything. He didn't argue, didn't throw out another insult, didn't try to salvage the last scraps of his pride. He just sat there, breathing heavy, knowing. Celine shifted her gaze toward Henry, still seated in his wheelchair, still gripping the armrests, his fingers no longer clenched, his body no longer carrying the same tension that had been there just minutes ago. He was watching her, but differently now, not like someone waiting for trouble to pass, but like someone who had just witnessed something he never expected to see. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm, leaving no room for hesitation. Henry didn't wait, didn't look back, didn't glance